Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud, Lost Stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 3 of Little Blue Book number 1122, titled The Degradation of Woman, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1920s, something like that. And in the last video, we ended at the end of chapter 3, so we will start chapter 4. And here we go. Chapter 4, The Effect of Christianity. Let me at once oppose to this frothy rhetoric, this fanciful construction of history by men who will not take the trouble to study the facts, the sober and deliberate testimony of a great lawyer based upon the solid foundation of the actual tenor of the law. I have quoted Sir Henry Maine's recognition of the position of justice and freedom won for women by the Stoic lawyers. Christianity, he says, on page 156, tended somewhat from the very first to narrow this remarkable liberty. And the latest Roman law, so far as it is touched by the constitutions of the Christian emperors, bears some marks of a reaction against the liberal doctrines of the great Antonine jurisconsults. I try always to let my reader know what the best informed religious writer or scholar would at each step say to my arguments and facts. For the mass of popular Christian literature, I have too much disdain to answer. It is appallingly untruthful, and unfortunately, it is just from this literature that preachers and the great bulk of the faithful derive their ideas. Yet even the more scholarly Christian writer is apt to betray an inaccuracy of knowledge and a straining of the evidence which deprive his conclusions of value and entitle them to little or no respect. Here, he would remind me that the new liberty of the Roman woman was won by weakening the institution of marriage, and that Christianity strengthened marriage, and so fortified and uplifted the position of women. It is true that the freedom and the right to own property of the Roman woman were won by an attack upon the old form of marriages. This ancient ceremony conferred upon the husband his despotic power over the wife, and no enlightened generation would perceive it or preserve it. But Roman law and religion were, as they always are, conservative, and the ceremony was invaded rather than replaced. Looser forms of marriage were introduced. They were, however, recognized in law, and were as valid as a modern marriage. All that the Christian writer can mean, if he knows the facts, is that divorce was comparatively easy and frequent, and that the Church now came forward with the doctrine that the union of man and wife was a holy thing, a sacrament, an indissoluble association. Sir Henry Maine has this in mind chiefly when he speaks of the reaction caused by the Church. And the distinguished Christian lawyer calls the change, insofar as there was any change, there was very little in the 4th century. A reaction, not an advance, because he knows well that it tended to restrict the rights of women without, in the least, securing for them greater respect. Sir Henry Maine was no theologian. In point of fact, marriage was not a sacrament to the Christian of the 4th century. An aesthetic priest here and there might publish the speculations of his dreamy hours about sacraments. The Christian leader generally might pour their disdain upon the flesh and its joys. But the great mass of the Roman people, even after their conversion to Christianity, regarded marriage and divorce as civic and human affairs, and did not listen to the clergy. The Church did not obtain control of marriage until the 11th century. Until that time, the clergy themselves were commonly married, and the laity had almost as much liberty of divorce as the pagans had had. I have written a special work on the subject, The Influence of the Church on Marriage and Divorce, 1916, and carefully studied every phase of the transition. The only meaning, therefore, that one can read into the common claim that the Church won respect for women is that the religious writer supposes that the Church induced women to be more chaste and thus earned the respect of men. This, as I amply show in other books, is a double untruth. It is a repetition of the threadbare legend of pagan vice and the discredited legend of Christian virtue. I have, I trust, amply shown that the charge against the Romans rests on vague and unsatisfactory grounds. I will merely give here one or two authoritative opinions. Dr. L. Friedlander is one of the highest authorities on the morals of the Romans. He was a Christian and a Puritan, yet in his classical, I'm not even going to try to attempt the German title of this book. Here's what he says in that book. There is something to show that imperial Rome. Okay, let me start that again. There is something to show that in imperial Rome, shamelessness ever went so far as it did in Paris about the middle of the 18th century. And instead of Christian Paris, the learned writer would have been still more confident of his case if he had taken Papal Rome in the 10th or the 15th century, or Papal Avignon in the 14th century. Dr. Fairbairn, who is esteemed one of the most scholarly Christian writers on the subject, says that we know not how destitute of true and generous action the Roman world was. And to this, another Christian writer, Dr. Emil Reich, an historian who really knows and loves ancient Rome, replies with a vigor and irony which would do credit to a pagan. And here's what Dr. Emil Reich said. It would be the easiest thing in the world to accumulate examples of the most tender charity practiced by these immoral Romans. Justice in imperial Rome, in this rotten and diseased Rome, was administered in the most perfect way. We seldom or never hear a complaint over the injustice of judges or the injustice of the imperial chamber, the liberty of citizens, even the perfect safety of slaves, were protected by powerful laws. These rotten Romans of the first 3 centuries, instead of dozing away in idle profligacy, were the founders of thousands of flourishing cities. These rotten Romans protected everybody and persecuted nobody. The innumerable nations under these diseased Romans felt so happy that they never, or very rarely, thought of revolting against a rule at once so mild and so profitable. The History of Civilization, page 371. I should like to quote in full the warm tribute to the Romans of this sincere believer in the Bible, but it is too long. And if you remind me that he seems to have overlooked all the terrible things which the poet Juvenal wrote about the rich women of Rome, I retort that Juvenal, a licensed satirist, wrote about a class and a generation which he knew not, and that so sober an authority as Sir Samuel Dill says that in his, Juvenal's, own modest class, female morality was probably as high as it ever was, as high as the average morality of any age. As to the higher class, I may remind the reader that the Emperor Octavian sentenced his beloved daughter to exile for life for adultery. Hydration. Oh, my cup. I got that when I went to visit the History Museum in Garrard, Kansas, where the little blue books come from. Okay, side note. Whatever the proportion of virtue and vice in this pagan world was, There is not one single bit of evidence of improvement when Christianity triumphed. There is, on the contrary, ample evidence of actual deterioration. On the one hand, the pagan ideas so far remained that we find St. Augustine himself permitting a man to take a concubine into his home if his wife proves barren. We find Paulinus of Pella boasting that he guarded the treasure of chastity and was content with the enjoyment of the female slave of the house. We find the first synod of Toledo under the archbishop laying it down in its 17th canon that a man who has a mistress, but not a wife also, may be admitted to communion. On the other hand, every contemporary Christian authority assures us that from the 5th century onward, the morals of Europe suffered a swift, appalling deterioration. Thus, the main plea of the writers who try feverishly to show that the new religion improved the position of women is demonstrably false. Neither men nor women became more virtuous. We should, in fact, find any such service to women reflected in the legislation of the Christian emperors, and as Sir Henry Maine says, even every innovation in their laws tends to restrict women's rights and liberties. I have, in my work on marriage and divorce, collected and analyzed such innovations as there were, and they constitute, as Professor J. Muirhead says, a miserable chapter in the history of law. After the severe verdicts of two such experts, it is needless to dilate on the various changes of the law by Christian emperors. Constantine restricted the grounds of divorce to 3, but his successors allowed his law to lapse. Theodosius, the brutal and superstitious soldier who, as I describe in The Triumph of Christianity, Little Blue Book number 1110, bludgeoned the rival religions out of existence, applied the ideas of the clergy, and certainly no modern American will see anything but the most cruel harshness to women in his enactments. He forbade the marriage of cousins. He imposed severe disabilities on any woman who married again after the death of her husband. He forbade a woman to remarry for 5 years, and then restricted her right to inherit if she had divorced her husband for a very grave cause, and if she divorced her husband for one of the lighter causes recognized in the law, she lost her dowry. She was strictly forbidden to marry again, and was liable to a sentence of banishment. The husband, I may add, was, in the same circumstances, permitted to marry again. This is the new fairness to women, as seen in the legislation of the most priest-ridden of all the Roman emperors. Were compelled to repeal them, yet each in turn attempted some new interference with the right of divorce. In practice, during the whole of this period, the people followed the old Roman custom of divorce by mutual consent, or for any of the dozen serious reasons. In the West, the ruin of the empire reduced everything to a chaotic condition. Synods of bishops repeatedly attempted to impose indissoluble marriage, but they failed. The prayer books of the Anglo-Saxon Church, as late as the 9th century, recognized several grounds for divorce, and it was the same in France. In the East, where Roman law continued in force, it was remodeled by Justinian, and 6 or 7 specific grounds of divorce were admitted. It was not until the 11th and 12th centuries that the clergy got control of marriage, with what awful results you may read elsewhere. In point of historical fact, therefore, we find little more than the failure of the Church during 7 or 8 centuries to achieve what it proposed to do, to set up indissoluble marriage. Its real influence was apart from legislation, and we must ask how far its teachings was calculated to improve, or did in fact improve, the position of women. The crop of feminist literature, which the rapid progress of the women's movement brought into existence a few years ago, contains more than one work of a Christian character. As I will tell in the last chapter, this task had been for decades left almost entirely to non-Christian writers and agitators. In their books, the works of Miss Cady Stanton, Miss Gage A. Beble, etc., the grievance against the Christian religion was very frankly, if not very vehemently, expressed. Neither Jesus nor any follower of Jesus before the 19th century had helped women, and even in 3/4 of the 19th century, in spite of the flagrant degradation of women's position, very few Christians, and the world was still overwhelmingly Christian, and no clergymen would open their lips. In spite of them, the movement throve, and then Christian accounts of the evolution of women's position and her debt to Christianity began to appear. I have one of the most orthodox of these before me, and I see with some interest the page in which the lady describes women's indebtedness to Christ. It is amusing. Jesus, it seems, insisted that men and women were equal, because he described them as twain in one flesh. I should have thought that Christian delicacy would prevent any lady from trying to read a mystic meaning into the very broad remark. Next, we are reminded that after his resurrection, Jesus appeared first to a woman, which is one of the least historical statements in the latest part of the Gospels. Thirdly, and this completes the case, we are reminded that Jesus saved an adulterous woman from death and bade her go and sin no more, which is one of the most flagrantly apocryphal stories in the New Testament. For any such interference with the course of Jewish law would have been drastically resented. The writer discreetly omits to notice that in text after text, Jesus speaks harshly of his mother, and in no single text has he a tender or affectionate word for her. Jesus, the dreamer, who saw the end of the world close at hand, the ascetic who saw in the sweet charm of women only a snare of the devil, never troubled for a moment about women's position. Not one word of his was calculated to affect it. The gospel writers, it is true, attribute to him certain words about divorce, not mentioned by the Protestant lady to whom I have just referred, which have had a profound influence on women. But these words are given in two contradictory versions, and this plainly shows that they are merely the interpolluted opinions of two rival schools in the early church. The Jews themselves in the time of Jesus were divided as to whether divorce should be permitted for adultery or entirely forbidden. The quarrel passed on into Christianity. What the devout Christian ought to ask himself is, why Jesus, who, he believes, foresaw all things, permitted this ambiguity on the fundamental issue to be given to the world in his name. On this, however, we will not linger. Protestant America, in practice, rejects both versions of the words of Jesus. The indissolubility of marriage, or even the restriction of divorce to adultery. It is so patent a cause of immorality that whether Jesus said it or no, the good Protestant demands a more proper and humane and less disastrous rule of life. I have said that Jesus never gave a thought to the question of women's position, and it is usual to blame Paul for the profoundly mischievous spirit which got into the early church. But Paul, here at least, does not differ from Jesus. It is the asceticism or Puritanism of both that led to the degradation of women. She is the chief implement used by the devil in his scheme of temptation. The gentle touch of her hair upon your cheek, the ripe lips that draw you, the tender pressure of her breasts, the white, rounded limbs and finely molded neck. The devil smiles cynically in every one of her allurements, and the ascetic sees only that imaginary smile. What Paul adds to this general aestheticism is a reminder of the childish yet faithful reference to women in Genesis. She was made out of man and for man, and she at once dragged him down from a state of semi-divine bliss to all the horrors and labors of earthly life. Man, says Paul, not only may but must remove his hat in church, forasmuch as he is the image of God, image and glory of God. But woman must veil her head, for she was made from man and for man, and not in the image and likeness of God. There is no need to quote Paul's other depreciations of women, though if there is anything in Christian tradition, he found the devoted attention of maids like Thecla very comforting amidst his labors. Ooh. We have only to glance over the works of the fathers to see how these two ideas, the ascetic scorn of women's sweetest ministry in life, her love and the belief in her inferiority on account of her origin and her primary share in the fall, brought into the life of Europe the element which caused and explains the degradation of women. Scores of these quotations from the fathers are given in feminist histories, while even the Christian historians can find no pleasant or tender sentiment to put in the scale against these profoundly mischievous aphorisms. Some of the quotations are inaccurate. Clement of Alexandria did not say, as Lecky quotes him, that fornication is but a lapse from one marriage into many. St. Ambrose did not say that woman is plainly inferior, since she was built out of a mere rib of man. For the work in which this is said is spurious. But there remain scores. Special research would find hundreds of references to marriage and women which poured a poison into the blood of Europe. Already in the 2nd century, Justin pronounced that a man who marries a divorced woman is guilty of adultery, and Athenagoras sneered at a second marriage as a decorous sort of adultery. St. Basil said, "The wife will take back her husband when he returns to her from his whoring, but the husband will cast forth a sinful wife from his house." Origen said that Origen said that digamists are saved in the name of Christ, but are no means crowned by him. I'm not sure what the damn digamist is. Contempt of marriage is associated with contempt of woman. St. Gregory of Nazarim, supposed to be the most tender and emotional, the least flinty, I should say, of the fathers, gives counsel in poetic form to the maid Olympias. She is not to study philosophy, for women's philosophy is to obey the laws of marriage. She must take no interest in public affairs, or attend even innocent entertainments. She may marry, but blessed is the man who soils not the divine image within him with the filth of concupiscence. And at last it comes. Florence is the dragon, cunning the asp, but woman has the malice of both. Tertullian is almost as eloquent. For Christian women, he writes, a book on the adornment of women. What do they want with finery, he asks. If, my beloved sisters, your faith were as firm as its eternal reward, no one of you, after learning of the living God and her own condition as a woman, would dare to seek gay apparel, but would dress in rags and remain in dirt, as a sorrowful and penitent Eve. And a few lines later, he hisses this fine Christian sentiment. Thou art the devil's gate, the destroyer of the tree, the first deserter of the divine law. Marriage, even, he says, as a sort of fornication. The learned Clement of Alexandria said, It brings shame to a woman even to reflect of what nature she is. Gregory, the wonder worker, said, "You may find one chaste man amongst 1,000, but not a woman." St. Ambrose said, "It becomes not the modesty of a maid to choose a husband." Paulinus of Nola invented the phrase weaker vessel, on the ground that the devil found women easier to tempt. St. Augustine said, in his commentary on Genesis, that man was made to rule, woman to obey. And in the second commentary, he asks with portentous seriousness why woman was created at all, and can find no decent answer. Possibly, he reflects, it was just part of the divine scheme to create a being of inferior personality so as to ensure that the fall would take place. God, man, they hated women. His contemporary, St. Jerome, who was the spiritual director of the prettiest and wealthiest young ladies of the Roman Church, habitually scorned women and all tender sentiment. Woman is the root of all evil, and marriage is good for those who are afraid to sleep alone at night. In one beautiful letter, which his lady pupils learned by heart, he says, "Though thy father cling to thee, and thy mother rend her garments and show thee the breasts thou hadst suckled, thrust them aside with dry eyes to embrace the cross." Boy, these guys were weird. These were the sentiments which the great interpreters of the Christian message give to the world. At first, it is obvious, the world at large took little or no notice of them. But to say, in the face of them, that the new religion uplifted women and taught men a respect for her which the pagans had not known is worse than empty rhetoric. It is stupid. It is very little use to remind us how the Church exalted Mary. She was not placed upon so high as Isis and Cybele. But the main point is that the special treatment of Mary did not affect women generally. There was to be no second Mary. Woman was the devil's gate, the cause of the curse and of Christ's death, the weaker vessel, the worst occasion of sin and damnation, and so on, except in one special case, which no other woman could imitate. Nowhere else in Christian rhetoric quite so insincere. I have shown that from Paul to Augustine, all the Christian leaders used contemptuous language about women, and no language, either of Jesus or any distinguished follower of his, can be quoted in the opposite sense. On the other hand, as we shall now see, the historical facts as are plain as facts can be. Woman was not uplifted, but she sank when Europe became entirely and thoroughly Christian, to a position which she had not known throughout the whole history of civilization. And that is the end of chapter 4. Yep, chapter 4. And that is the end of Little Blue Book. Yeah, that is the end of part 3 of Little Blue Book number 1122, titled The Degradation of Woman, written by Joseph McCabe. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 4.